Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, the Joint Center's Director of Fellowships and Events, and it's a pleasure for me to welcome you to today's talk, which will focus on the Center's new household projections for the next 2 decades. Before we begin, I want to highlight three more talks this semester. 2 weeks from today, we will have a presentation on making housing and long-term care affordable for older Americans. That'll feature new research coming out of the Center's Housing and Aging Society program with some commentary and discussion with some key federal officials thinking about these issues. 3 days later, on Monday, November 18th, we'll have an online session only. The first session is also online only, that'll focus on a notable initiative in Los Angeles County that is using AI to predict and prevent homelessness. This is a really interesting initiative that's bringing together researchers at UCLA and officials from LA County. And finally, on Thursday, December 6th, we'll be doing a hybrid event with New York AIA focused on innovative approaches to creating, developing, and financing mid-rise housing, particularly in New York City. There will be an in-person portion at New York AIA and also online for those of you who can't make that. More information about these and other future events are on our website and in our email. Now on to today. Our speaker today is Dan McCue, a senior research associate here at the Center. Many of you know Dan as the project manager and lead author of the Center's signature annual State of the Nation's Housing Report. Indeed, Dan discussed that report at our first seminar this semester. His research covers a wide range of housing-related issues, particularly those related to demographics, housing supply, demand, home ownership, housing affordability, and other topics. Dan also oversees the periodic updates to the Center's household growth projections, which is what he'll be discussing today, and which we'll be publishing in a few weeks. Dan will take about 40 minutes to share those new household projections. He'll explain the factors that drove them and explore how the demand for new housing, how they'll affect the demand for new housing in the next 2 decades. I'll then moderate a Q&A, drawing in large measure from questions you can submit via Zoom's Q&A feature. One of my colleagues, Chris Herbert, will also be monitoring those questions and, wherever possible, answering some of them online. Apologies in advance if we don't get to your questions. We'll close at about 1:15 p.m. The video of today's event will be posted early next week. We won't be posting the slides until we publish the new projections and how they were developed, which we expect to do in the next couple of weeks. Dan, it's all yours.
All right, thanks. Thanks, David, and thanks everybody for tuning in. Let me share my screen here with slideshow for you. But yes, as David said, I'm going to go through today a little bit on our new household projections, and as well as our projections for new housing demand, new construction needed in the next 10 and 20 years. These are, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what they are, about how we make them and what goes into them and what they're saying, and then kind of conclude with, I'm sure as you hear this, you'll have your own thoughts on the implications for the trends that these projections describe. But I'm going to go through a few ideas and thoughts on what it all means, and what are some policy implications ahead in the next 2 decades. So now let me start with what are our household projections and our new home demand projections. I say there's 2 different things. We start with the household projections, which is a nationwide projection of the number of households in the United States. We do 3 different years, projecting for 2025, 2035, and 2045. The projections are nationwide, so we don't have states, we don't have regions, but it's a big picture look at growth in the number of households in the U.S. But we do, have categories of growth. We have growth by 5-year age categories, from age 15 to age 80 and over. We have race and ethnicity categories. And also household types, so we can kind of see the growth and change in different types of housing demand that we see on the horizon. And once we have the household projections, we take it a step further and say how many, given that we expect this many new households. How many new housing units are we going to need to build in the next 10 and 20 years to satisfy this demand, plus demand for other things beyond just household growth that add needs to construction, like replacement of units that are torn down, need for second homes and the like. So summing it all up in to get a picture of the environment for new construction in the coming decades. So how do we build them and what's involved in them? Well, it's a demographically driven projection, and by that I mean it doesn't incorporate economic trends, cycles. It's purely the demographics. So those categories of age and race are really what's driving these projections. And the thought is that it's the demographics are the base of the demand, and then the economic factors will lead to kind of adjustments around that, and they're more short term. So this is the long-term demographic picture, and we do our household projections. We time them to when the Census Bureau puts out their population projections, because the population projections are one of two major inputs to the household projections. So we really start with population growth. And the population growth we can get from those categories by age and race. And to each category of age and race, we add a headship rate to kind of calculate, to convert population into households, because a headship rate is how many households per person. It's kind of the likelihood of each person to head an independent household, and that changes by age and race. So when we combine them, these two factors, population times households per person, we come up with our future projections for household growth. Just to dig a little bit deeper into this multiplier we use on population, which we call headship rates. Headship rates really differ by age and race. We can see on the left what we mean by headship rates and how it works when we apply it to the population projections is, so we can see, say for the 20 to 24-year-old olds on the left here, we see this, it's just around a little more than 20 households per every 100 people. So when the population projections say, okay, we're gonna see growth of X hundred white persons ages 20 to 24, we know that for every 100 we'll get 20 households out of that in this these assumptions. But it changes over time, so you can see it really during those young adult age groups, headship rates really rise quickly as people reach the ages of forming their households and living independently. But then they drift upwards from there through older ages. And so by the time we get to 80 plus, if you keep on the left side, you see the 80 plus year olds. You can see about for every 100 Black people age 80 and over, we could expect 70 additional households. So high headship rate there. And so that's a little bit of a picture. But so headship rates change by differ by age and race, but they also have been drifting over time. So we do incorporate a drift for a short time in our headship rates. And so on the right hand side of this slide, you can see how headship rates have been drifting downward for young adults. And we kind of look at the example of Hispanics age 25 to 29. With affordability, getting harder and more barriers to household formation. It's not just Hispanic people, but younger adults across the board. This is just an example of the younger adult headship rates kind of drifting down over time. So we take that and continue it forward till about the trend until about 2030, and then figure we'll reassess from there. Headship rates for middle age groups are and have been somewhat stable. So this kind of shows the stability in headship rates over time for the people in the middle ages. And we also kind of build in the kind of long-term trend of increasing headship rates of older adults. And so here we can see, as older adults are more likely to live at home rather than in nursing care facilities in older ages. We have more single person households, one household per person. So that's a high headship rate. So we've seen, the increased, aging in place and ability to live at home alone into older ages, raising the headship rates over time for older adults. So that's a little bit of what that multiplier is doing, that we add to our population projections that we get from the census. So what's it all saying? Bottom line, the pace, when we add this all together and project out for the next 10 and 20 years, you see the pace of household growth is slowing. From about 11.2 million households over the next 10 years. So it's about a little over a million households per year added on to the housing stock, and then really kind of slowing even further in this 2035 to 2045 period in our high projection of 7.9 million, so just about 800,000 per year growth in households. But in our low estimate, that goes all the way down to 500,000 per year. So this really long, this pretty significant decline we're seeing over the next 20 years in the pace and level of household growth. You can kind of see what that means in terms of the number of households in both our high projection and our low projection, which I'll explain a little bit in a little bit what the difference is between them. But it's really based on the underlying population projection scenarios that we look. So why are things, what's the major cause of this long-term slowdown in household growth? And it's really it's really getting driven by the underlying decline in population growth. So here on the left is kind of showing that orange line is really showing you average population growth really sliding down. So since population growth is our number one, is our major input into the household projections, it's really behind this decline in household growth that we're seeing. And what's behind the decline in population growth is the slowdown in growth of the native-born population. And so that means the number of deaths in the native population really outnumbering the number of births. And so that's really it has for decades been the leading the leading source of population growth has been growth of the resident native population. And we're in a period now where that's changing. And so we can see the rising on the right hand side. The reason that natural growth is rising or is declining so rapidly is because of this increasing number of deaths, the increasing mortality rate of the population. That's really due to the aging of the baby boom generation and the aging of the population in general. We have far more people in the age groups with the highest mortality rates, and so that's really going to be adding on, accelerating the number of deaths per year that we're expecting in the population over time. But I was talking about the real shift. We're kind of in an area of transition between three phases. So up until about 2020, we had most of the population growth was due to the native-born population births and deaths, and immigration was kind of not, like it was about 30 to 50%. But as native growth has declined, we're now in a period where immigration is the majority of growth. In the early 2020s, just a couple of years ago, immigration exceeded natural growth as the leading contributor to population growth. And so up until just about 2027, we see here immigration is the majority of population growth, and that gets us into in the late 2030s, 2040s, where we'll be in a situation where immigration is responsible for all of the population growth as native-born growth turns negative, as the number of births does not keep up with the rising number of deaths in the population. And so that means the big, takeaway here is that immigration is an uh, large part of growth in the population, and as a result, in turn, increasingly important to future household growth. We can see here, the Census Bureau population projections that we have come in a main series, which, as we see here, assumes about 900, an average of 900,000 immigrants per year over our projection period. And that leads to this population growth, projected population growth, kind of dropping from about 1.5 million per year in 2025 down to 1 million per year in 2035, all the way down to just 500,000, people per year added onto the population in 2045. And big difference between that and the high projection that that's offered is immigration. So much of the expected population growth is based on the assumption, the expectation, the projection for future levels of immigration, which is a big wild card. But you can see here it has a big impact on the projected population growth. Almost 1 million per year difference in population growth between the census main series population projection and the census high immigration estimate population projection. Normally, we would just use the main population projection as our, the base between our main household projection. But we had a little wrinkle in that the Census Bureau population projections, which we need for their detailed age and race components, were put out just before the surge in immigration. So they don't incorporate the surge in immigration, and therefore they're underestimating, immigration and population growth in the near term. And so that had us think about, how can we account for this? And the solution that we have in these is to propose to use the Census Bureau's high immigration projection, which, even though it doesn't incorporate, the surge in immigration we've been getting over the past few years, it assumes a higher annual estimate going forward that evens out, across by the end of our projection period, we do see it catching up to the immigration estimates and the population growth estimates from here we show the CBO, which actually does include the effects of the recent surge, although it doesn't have the detail of the demographic detail that we need for our household. So again, you can see the extreme difference between the high projection and the low projection. I think another way of looking at our high immigration projection scenario is one that assumes immigration evens off after this surge happens. It evens off at about 1 million per year, whereas our low projection, using the lower immigration estimates here in the light orange, you can assume that basically means immigration evens out at 1 million per year, even when including the surge. So it would entail immigration levels after the surge to really get very, very low going forward after the surge. So it's a wide sensitivity between our highs and lows. Basically, immigration evening out at 1 million, or immigration really being very little over the next 20 years. So that's a little bit about the building blocks. Another thing I wanted to talk about is the shape of the slowdown in household growth. And the slowdown in household growth, the point here is that household growth is not slowing due to a slowdown in new household formations, which is important. You can see here that when you follow on the left-hand side, we're looking at the number of households for each generation. So see the number of households of Gen Z and younger kind of growing pretty rapidly, from 16 million in 2025 to 40 million in 2035 to 66 million. So significant growth, growing by 24 million households, you can see on the right in that period, and then another 26 million over the next. So new, plenty of new young households being formed. what's really cutting into that is the increased losses, really kind of mirroring the losses that we see in the population, increased mortality rate. But we also have a household version of mortality rate, and that's dissolutions. And so we see more and more households over time being lost. And the increase in lost households, um, which we see going from, losing about 15, 1.5 million households per year lost from boomers and older generations over the next 10 years. And then, losing about 1.7 million households a year after that. Right now, we're running at about losing about 1.2 million. So we're going to see a pickup over the next 10 years of an additional 300,000 households per year being lost, um, which is really that's what's cutting into in causing this slowdown. The increased household formations is not increasing enough to keep up with these additional losses of older adult households. But I just want to talk a little bit about why are there so many new household formations? And we have to remember that the Gen Z is a big generation following the millennials. We've talked for a long time about millennials being the largest generation in history, and Gen Z, looking at the birth records, the birth rates, Gen Z actually incorporates the time when U.S. births peaked in 2007. So it's a big generation that doesn't come through. Here we look at kind of the population by age. When you look at the population by age now, millennials are actually a larger population here on the left. But the millennials, unlike Gen Z, millennials have had the advantage of 15 extra years of immigration adding to their ranks. And so on the right side, it's a bit of a complicated story, but on the right side, you can kind of see, we look back 15 years and see the millennial generation at the same age as current Gen Z, or at least Gen Z in 2022. We can see that Gen Z is a larger cohort than millennials. And so this chart on the right also shows you how much the millennial cohort has risen in size over the 15 years of immigration. So basically, this is the fundamentals of why we see household formations continuing to be households that are forming. This is a little zoom in on the left of the households forming and a zoom in on the right of the households dissolving. It's contributing to the rising ethnic and racial diversity of U.S. households. The households being formed are much more racially and ethnically diverse. We still see the largest group is white households forming, but less than 50% of new households formed are white households, and shares of households formed that are formed from people of color rising even more in the 2030s, 2035 to 2045 period. At the same time, the households that are dissolving are much more have much higher shares of non-Hispanic white households. So they're much less kind of evenly diverse across race and ethnicity, and so that's contributing to the increasing diversity of U.S. households at all. So overall, so when we look, specifically at growth in households by race, we can see the largest growth over the next 10 years, being among Hispanic and Asian households, and households of color really making up 96% of the growth over the next 10 years, and then all of the growth over the following 10 years as a result of losing so many non-Hispanic older white households. We'll be pulling down that. So increased diversity going forward. The other major trend in household growth is the significant growth in households age 80 and over. So boomers, baby boomers, the oldest of the boomers are going to start turning 80 in 2026. So a couple of years from now. So that's really going to start lifting the number of households headed by people age 80 and over. You can see here, almost doubling in the next 20 years. So sharp growth, almost 60% growth over 10 years, and and almost doubling over 20. So this is going to have a big implications over the shape of demand for housing and services and neighborhood service. We'll get to the implications in a minute, but this is a big factor. And you can see the growth levels by age on the right. And I wanted to point out on this one is, let's not forget that the millennials are also part of the aging of the household population too. And aging of the millennials into their 40s and 50s over the next 10, 20 years is going to boost demand, boost the number of households headed by people in their middle ages. And this is going to mean more families with children. This is something that has not happened for quite some time, a few decades, but since we've seen growth in this age group. A little sense of what what the growth, this distribution of growth by age means to households is, here's our projection by household type for the 2025 to 2035 period. And we can see the growth in the older adults will really be reflected in significant growth in households that are single people living alone, and married couples without children, people, empty nesters and that. But we also see the next highest categories are married with children growth, which has been flat for the last 10 years and down, the previous 10 years before that. So increasing number of married with children households and unmarried children, unmarried partners with children as well. And so, reflecting potential increased demand for thinking about home ownership, thinking about size needs for this growth in households with children, so that some of the implications of this growth. Additionally, we're not just going to have a growth in the number of households headed by 80-year-olds and over. We're going to have increased demand for multi-generational living, households headed by younger adults with an 80-year-old person in them. And so this is kind of showing growth in multi-generational living by two different ways. So this is just households who have their older parent living with them. And so the purple bars we can see are the householders who have an aging parent living with them. And so you'd read this by saying, like, there's 600,000 householders aged 40 to 44 that had their parent living with them in 2022. The orange shows the households, by the age of the household parent. So the way you'd read this orange part is that in 2022 there were 1.2 million households with a parent age 80 and over with living with them. So keep thinking about this 1.2 million number, and let me zoom out to our projection. And there it is on the left, looking pretty small now, because the number of households that that will have a parent who's age 80 and over living with them is set to almost double by 2035, and then almost triple by 2045. So significant growth in this segment of multi-generational living. And here we see the total overall, you're going from a projected 4.8 million households with a parent living with them to almost 8 million households. So pretty significant growth in this, and thinking about the needs of households, multi-generational households with an older adult living with them. It also, multi-generational living also means increased, parents with adult children living with them. And so here's the kind of the same way. So on the orange, you see 3.8 million households with a 25 to 29-year-old child, living in them. So a lot of the households with adult children living in them, very skewed by age. So most of them are young, on the younger end of the age group. And you can see in the purple, you see 2 million householders aged 60 to 64 with an adult child living with them. So you can kind of get a sense of the distribution of these types of multi-generational living. So again, looking at that 3.8 million, growing a bit. It's a large number. You can see the number of far more households have an adult child living with them than an aging parent. But still some growth. It's significant growth. So growing by about almost 1 million households with an adult child living with them. So So just thinking about the demand for multi-generational living on this end, and what that means for overall housing demand. So summing up the household growth part, household growth slowing. Growth is increasingly dependent on immigration. A lot of the slowdown in household growth really due to older generations giving up households at higher rates, and less so about reduced new household formations of young adults. We still have those levels will still be high. The new formations, the combination of new formations, much more diverse, and dissolutions, much less diverse, will mean higher households and increasing shares of households of color in the future, and really increases in the older adult households and households with older adults in them. And so, what are the implications of this? And the first implication is we have a whole section of the report is the new housing demand. So we kind of separate this because it's such a large factor, but the demand for new construction over the next 10, 20 years is set to decline with this declining growth in the number of households. So you can see here, household growth is the #1 factor in new housing demand here, the largest thing. So 11.2 million million new households need to be housed somewhere. So we need to build housing to accommodate them. Plus, we have a certain number of vacancies to maintain a workable vacancy rate, so that people can move around. But the second largest factor is replacement units, replacing units lost due to obsolescence, due to demolitions, due to natural disasters. So that's a big factor going forward that comes into it. But still, we see, so with all those factors involved, we see the 2025 to 2035 period for basic baseline demand for 14 million new households over that period, and also declining over the next period for 10.7. So where does this line up historically? Historically, the 14.1 million kind of lines up with the rates of construction we've had in the 2020s so far. But the decline, down to 10.7 million, the next 10-year period is really, would be a real downturn, right, in demand, lower than any recent decade except the 2010s, where we had the large downturn in construction. So getting into those components, I talked about replacement demand. Replacement demand projected about 2 to 2.5 million units needed to replace the units lost. Where does this come from? You can see on the left, we're talking about, for accommodating new housing, we're talking about growing the size of the housing stock, and you need to build a little bit more units than you want the housing stock to grow, because a certain number of units are being demolished every year. So this on the left is really just showing, here's how many units in the past that we built, and here's the resulting change in the housing stock in the orange there. So you can see how much more housing units we need to build than to move the needle on increasing the housing stock. And so we're expecting, we're going to need to build about 200,000 additional units per year just to replace the ones that are lost over the next 10 years. Second homes, we need to replace, or we need to accommodate people wanting second homes. It's not an easy number here. I just included this slide to show how wide the estimates of second homes are. It's a tricky number to measure. It includes short-term rentals, which are increasingly hard to grasp in these surveys. But our projections look at the survey of consumer finances and the likelihood, the rates of second home ownership among the population by age. And it's a middle of the road estimate for the number of second homes out there. You can see here at 3 million. So here's on the left is the kind of rates of owning a second home that we apply, just so you can see it. just the number of projected growth in second homes. So we're seeing second home demand, growing by about 7% over the next 10 years, and additional, and 10% overall over the next 20 years. So that's the side of it. But like I said, there's a lot of unknowns here, and there's risk. We call them risk. I have them here, risk factors in this new housing demand projection, and it really doesn't incorporate any undersupply of housing that we would have now. So that's not involved. We would need to build, and we need to add housing to accommodate the current undersupply onto these levels. So that could increase the projected demand for new housing to a certain degree. Unpredictable immigration levels really affecting population and household growth. That's a big unknown going forward, and a big volatile factor. And also housing affordability really changing, and it would be factored in here, and changing the headship rate. But if there's ongoing decreases in affordability, that means it'll be harder and harder for these new households to form, and so that will mean less demand for new housing. The other factors I won't get into, but they'll be in the but a little bit more. I mean, the projections don't include any additional. So this is kind of just showing, like, current estimates are from 1.5 to 5.5 million additional units needed to accommodate the current shortage of housing units. So just a little quick look at how that would play in terms of the historical need for housing, in the next 10 years relative to how much housing construction happened in the past. So just kind of imaging, what this would look like. But that as in, so just to sum up, the new housing demand for new housing slowing in line with the slowing household growth over the next 10 and 20 years. Higher shares of existing stock, of new household growth, higher shares of new household growth being accommodated by the existing housing stock, because of so many household dissolutions, and several things that we don't know. It's a wide variation in our future demand projections. So I mean, I think just to pretty much sum it up, there's a lot of implications to these. So I just want to sum up one more time, what we conclude here. And so the number one, household growth set to slow over the next 2 decades. And what does that mean? Fewer new housing units needed, more turnover, more people accommodated. So that, the fact that it's being driven, the slowdown is being driven by more losses of older adult households, means, it means there's going to be a lot of churning of that stock, which is going to increase kind of remodeling needs, and rehabilitation of households. The average, homeowner age 80 and over has been in their homes for over 30 years. So, just the updating that stock for the new resident will be a big source of market activity in the future. Another big takeaway: higher dependence on immigration for growth. And so immigration, compared to kind of the really long-term, big stable kind of trends of mortality and birth rates that have long driven, household growth trends and population growth trends, that being replaced by immigration, which is much more volatile, unpredictable year to year. The CBO estimates have annual immigration levels varying from 200,000 a year to over 3 million. So year to year, not knowing what you're going to get, much more so. So, implications on policy needs to add a little more predictability into these, into this, what's going to be a major source of growth. Increased racial and ethnic diversity of households. I mean, there's so many implications of this, but one is really the increased urgency to reduce these longstanding gaps in home ownership, gaps in gaps in wealth. We can kind of see, just flipping real quick to one of the slides from the State of the Nation's Housing Report, persistent gaps in home ownership rates between whites and blacks, whites and Hispanics, and the implications of that's going to happen when there's growing numbers and shares of households that have traditionally had less access to home ownership, that don't have the legacies of wealth, that aren't set to be recipients of this legacy of wealth, the gifting of wealth from existing owners is a big issue that could have the potential of widening the racial and ethnic gaps in both homeownership and wealth going forward. So, a lot of concern in terms of the implications of this trend. But really another big factor that is last but definitely not least is the significant growth in older adult households, and specifically adults age 80 and over, and the extreme need to adapt the housing stock to the needs that are so much different for older adults than they are for younger adults. The financial supports that will be needed for older adults, given that older adults, here's a couple of charts from our Housing America's Older Adults report. How with age, disability rates rise exponentially here. And at the same time, incomes fall pretty much across the board. So the needs rise, the ability to kind of accommodate and pay for these growing needs falls. And on top of this, another the statistics from the Housing America's Aging Adults reports, just the incredibly small share of housing today that's accessible to people with mobility impairments is in the single digits. So a real need to update the stock for these changing needs, but also not just the stock, the neighborhoods, the housing and everything that comes along with it, as well as the services of this population going forward. So I think these are all big picture trends and lots of opportunities, but also lots of concerns going forward that we see in these household projections. So with that, I think that's it for my slides. I'll invite David here to ask. I see there's hopefully I can field some questions.
Dan, thank you. Really remarkable set of work here that I'm just there have been a host of questions, and those of you who are online, I do encourage you to flip through the answered questions portion of that. Chris Herbert has been, or several people named Chris Herbert apparently have been typing furiously, putting some answers.
Okay.
But I'm going to pull a couple of those, and a lot of questions related to methodology and clarification. I'm going to pull a couple of these out. Just let me just start on immigration. The numbers there are reflecting both documented, documented, and our best guesses on undocumented immigrants.
Correct. Yes. And these immigration estimates include everything.
Okay.
As best we know. The ones we're focusing on and the ones we're pinning our numbers to are ones that specifically are looking at records from the Department of Homeland Security and both the census bureaus and everything. So it's all included to try to be as all inclusive on this as possible. But it's hard to know, right? And it's hard. It's a difficult number to pin down.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that struck me on this was, as you noted, the CBO numbers show a significant surge in immigration, but they're also projecting that that's not going to be the new baseline level. And I'm not quite sure if we understand why they think numbers are going to come back down so that ultimately they converge with the Census Bureau, as opposed to saying, is there any reason to at least include an estimate that says that their surge number might become the new baseline?
Well, I mean, the surge is pretty unprecedented, and there, you know, the recent trends, have been, encounters at the border have been falling precipitously. They're down,
Yep.
um, you know, uh, almost to be like,
Yep.
you know, they were at 250,000, I think, a month, and now they're down to around 50,000 or something. So they have fallen. It was a surge that has, ebbed. The question is, what happens after the surge, right? And so, the number that they have, immigration going out at a future is not that different from what the census had originally, even though the census unfortunately put out their projections right before the surge. But it's not that far off, and it's somewhere around 1 million per year net gains from immigration. But even that is highly subject to change, and it's an estimate. It's about what immigration historically, in the past decades, it's been about 900,000, 800,000, around 1 million, but it's really gone up and down. But the average, it seems like such a simple, these seem like simple that, estimates for annual immigration just staying constant. But, if you think about long term, we're talking about 10-year periods, 20-year periods, averaging out at about 1 million is what we kind of, how you would read that, and so we have, that's our, so our higher estimate shows, would be, like I said, it would be basically like immigration levels averaging out about 1 million after the surge, following the CBO estimate. Whereas our lower one would be after the surge, immigration really tanking in order to include the surge and have immigration average about 1 million per year. And so that's, it's not, so that would be, much lower level. It would be very low, almost zero immigration, in the next few years. So it's a very tight number.
To name the elephant in the room, this is an incredibly difficult moment to predict immigration levels, at least for the next several years. By the time the paper comes out, you may have a slightly better feel for that. Several people, shifting gears here, as we often do, several people asked if you could describe, in a little bit more detail, your assumptions about replacements, which, as you noted, are a fairly important part of the projections. And just wondering how you ultimately, if you can sort of walk us through a little bit of how you landed the sort of methodology behind that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways to triangulate your way into how many housing units we lose, by comparing the construction completed to the change in the housing stock over the same period of time. You can say, well, if we built this many and the stock only grew that by that much, we must have had, you know, this, and that's what we can do with as one kind of benchmark. So we do that to kind of see and that's kind of what the slide was showing. But what we ultimately landed on for this, is a little slightly different approach, and that uses the components of inventory change reports, and it's following a table that is used by the Census Bureau in making its housing stock estimates, where you have a certain loss rate by region and by age of the housing unit. And so what we did is we kind of just used the same loss rates that the Census Bureau uses and apply them, to the stock going forward. And that's how we get to our number. And that's that is a little bit over 200,000 units per year when we apply kind of the Census Bureau's table of loss rates by year built and year built in region. And that itself comes from these cinch reports, which come from the American Housing Survey. And so but yeah, so we do our best, and it's all kind of detailed in numbers in the paper that's about to come out.
To what extent is that driven by the age of the housing unit? I know we've had other work that talks about the aging of our housing stock, um, or is that not as critical a factor as?
Yeah, I mean, the aging of the housing stock is another issue where you have higher, if we're going by year, well, if we're going by age, then yeah, so as the housing, gets older, we're gonna have more units kind of falling off. Subject to that. I think like one thought there mid-sentence that you probably saw go through my brain. But yeah, I mean, I think that has some. I think the one thing that we're conservative on this is that I think the natural disasters and the increased frequency of that could mean more new construction. So if you're specifically interested in construction, you know, levels and what they're going to be, we our factors would be basically, due to the loss rates in that period of time, which was like the early 2010s. So if natural disaster rates have been getting more frequent and more destructive since the 2010s, then that means our loss rates would be a little bit undercounting the losses that you could see going forward.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Couple questions. I think I can tie these two together. Can you talk a little bit about within the growth estimates, the trends of household types? Um, and that leads me, there were other questions that were asking whether we thought, given the changes in household types, there might be a change in the kind of demand for different kinds of units.
Right. And I was trying to kind of get at that a little bit, but I mean, I think the biggest change in household types, right, is the way we did that, was we really kind of looked at the distribution of household type by age and race. So we had kind of a grid. We weren't too fancy. We just kind of showed the overall distribution of where people of different ages and races, what their general distribution of household types, and we applied that to the future. Um, I mean, the main takeaway there, some of them, the biggest change was for increased number of older single person and older married couples without children, right? And whether or not that means more, people aging in place, that may not have too much of an impact on the structure types, right? If people choose to live in their homes, that's still a 3 bedroom or whatever, right? So there may not, that may not mean, oh, we need all these single bedroom units, because it's old. So I think that's the benefit of combining age and household type, right? To that analysis. You say, well, okay, well, let's not go crazy with, single bedroom households, because a lot of these are aging, may not, but the increased need for families with children, that has implications for needs for more larger households, especially if the current households of 3 4 bedrooms are still being inhabited, right, by older people who may not have children anymore but are don't need to move. So I think that that's why I wanted to focus on the point out the growth in the middle age group, because it has implications on the housing size needed and the implications on demand for home ownership too, as home ownership rates for
Mhm.
people married and unmarried partners with children are both much higher. So I think that's where I would point to for implications on new stock. And then intergenerational living, I think maybe accommodating an older parent living with you, which is done by householders of all ages, from people in their 20s to people in their 60s and 70s have their aging parent living with them. And so it's a wide array of potential householders who may need the same accommodations that we would say, oh, we have growing numbers of 80-year-old householders. This housing stock that they live in has needs, but now no, it's like a wider do. We can't just focus on households headed by 80-year-olds. We can look at the needs for accessibility improvements, maybe other housing types to enable older parents and a growing number of older parents to live with or near or aside their adult children. So yeah, I think a lot of things to think about there, right? So
Got it. Got it. There were several questions just asking how you handled multiracial households in these estimates. And this is, of course, a question that comes up pretty much in almost all the work that we do.
right. We have, I mean, interracial is a growing group. It's it's a very disparate group of, very, very diverse group. Could mean a lot of things. Current current definitions of multiracial households are whether or not the householder is multiracial, which is a problem, right? Because it's not it's not necessarily a household with people of multiple races included. So that's something we are, that affects this. So basically we are using kind of, large, and admittedly large groupings of races and ethnicities in these in these. So there is variation. We don't specifically include multiracial households. We hope to continue to make our projections more specific in that way. But these use the four. It's based on general smaller surveys. Give you the four largest groups that we can use to get enough sample size. And so we have non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic blacks, Hispanics, and which is a wide and diverse group, and all other households, which is generally Asian households, but all the others, which equals a big enough group for us to sample.
There were a bunch of questions related to things that actually aren't in this report, but may relate to some other work that you've done. And so I'm gonna throw them out there, A, to confirm that this is not where people are going to find this when the paper comes out, but if there's other stuff that you want to highlight. And in particular, there were questions about geographic um, differences in some of these household formation rates. And I don't know if you can say anything about that or if there's other work going on. And also, um, any thoughts we have about things like home ownership rates going forward. Again, I'm pretty sure neither of those, I know neither of those are in this, but is there anything that's coming down the pike that might help people think about that?
Well, definitely the next step in this, we're working hard on to add on 10-year projections to these household projections. So, projections for what this means in terms of the number of new homeowner households and
And
renter households.
your audio glitched out for just a
Oh,
second. Can you just say that seemed important? Can you
yep.
just repeat that about 10-year projections?
Sure. We are hard at work on a 10-year paper, kind of expanding these projections into tenure. And so that will go a long way in seeing, the expected demand for the number of new rental units and new homeowner units. Again, based on these demographic, demographic trends. The other question about headship rates by geography.
Or household, or even just household growth or decline by geography.
So those are kind of like geography. I think, yeah, I mean, I think I had that listed there. I didn't say anything about it, but I mean, in terms of geography and mobility, I think with overall decline in household growth in the country as a nation, one of the things I'm not incorporating is, higher construction needs from domestic mobility. So moves of, the population doesn't necessarily have to grow for us to need new housing if people move to where the housing isn't, right? And so I think I think that's going to mean going forward, if we have slower growth in households and population, it's going to be more of the construction is going to be, and more of the demand change is going to be due to people within the country moving around, that we'll have to get a better handle on, in terms of people, especially if people are, to tie in the other question, tie in if people are moving to less populated, lower cost areas, to form a household, right? Because that's where they can afford it, and they're still able to, to find a job there. So I think it all goes hand in hand, the affordability, household formation, the geography of that, the increased, role of changing geographies. But at the same time, uh, mobility rate. So it's, it's something where I mobility is not gonna, it's not gonna change, the magnitude of new demand from domestic migration. It'd be hard pressed, unless there's that, a big change in the migration rates. Yeah, it's not gonna be as big as what we're, to reduce the slowdown.
Well, we've come to the end of our allocated time, but by no means our allocated questions. To remind folks, several that asked, a video of this event will be posted by early next week. We won't be posting the slides until we release the paper, which should be in a couple of weeks. If you want to know when the paper is released, the easiest thing to do is be on the Joint Center's mailing list, because we'll have a blog out when that comes out. When I was thinking about this event and listening to you today, there's an apocryphal quote that supposedly was Yogi Berra. I believe it actually wasn't, like many Yogi Berra quotes, which is it's very hard to make predictions, particularly about the future. You've done, I think, an extraordinary job, and there are some predictions that are really clear. Household dissolution, this just really stunning growth in older households. The points you were making about Gen Z, um, and then there's this one that is really hard to make predictions about, which is going to be crucially important, on household formation and many other things, which is immigration. But I think you've given us a terrific framework for thinking about it. I know this is a really important function that the Joint Center plays. And I just want to thank you for what is clearly an amazing amount of work, that was transformed into an extraordinarily clear presentation. So I hope those of you online, will join me in thanking Dan, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks, when we'll actually be going into much more detail about some of the challenges for the older households. Thanks a lot, everybody, and have a great day.